Feel free to interact in the chat. Brian's going to be monitoring that. And so he can stop me and we can have questions at any point to make it more interactive. And also at a certain point go, let's move on, because I do hope to connect an actual field sketch time for you guys to help this connect a little better. So just heads up, I'm going to follow through this PowerPoint. Hopefully it's not too science heavy. I'm going to try and keep it just a little more general. And so for introductions for myself, Miriam Morrill. I live in Rancho Cordova, which is kind of part of Sacramento, over off of 50, pretty close to the American River, which I love. So a lot of my sketches and journaling revolve around this area, especially on the phenology weather topics that we'll be going through. And I work for the U.S. Bureau of Land Management at the California State Office in Fire Management. So I manage fire prevention, mitigation, fire investigation programs. So I don't get out in the field as much in my level position. So this is kind of my fun passion thing, where I connect my knowledge in fire to my passion and my hobbies. And so you'll see a heavy influence of fire topics, but it is all very connected. So with that, I'm going to launch into my presentation here, and hopefully you can see it. So we're going to talk phenology, but in order to kind of understand phenology, we're going to compare it to some other things. So if you're journaling, you'll know the difference between phenology. I'm kind of referencing what I'm calling function and form, and then seral stages. So we'll kind of highlight some of those topics. So phenology, I got to find a way to hide the, hold on, I might have to step out to hide the camera stuff because I can't read my stuff. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So phenology is the study of periodic plant and animal cycle events and how these are influenced by seasonal and interannual variation in climate. So what does that mean? You can kind of see the little picture there of the phases, these life cycles that plants and animals, and this is not just plants, it's plants and animals, and how the range of climate, your seasonal influences. So you think of what are things going through in the springtime versus the fall, those starting to bloom versus the leaves are changing colors. So phenology are those kind of seasonal annual life cycles of plants and animals, but it's tied to climate and weather. So even though a lot of people kind of, talk about doing phenology, sketching these life cycles, if you're not really putting it in context of climate and of seasonal weather attributes, you're kind of missing some of the more deeper what actually phenology is. So you got to combine the two. All right. So if you're going to be out there observing nature, a lot of times when you're looking at these phases and changes, sometimes you might be looking at what's called seral stages. I think I might have a misspelling there, seral stages of vegetation communities. So for instance, a wildfire, a flood, some kind of significant event comes in and takes out a lot of what had been there. You're going to start over in this new development. And so sometimes you're going to see those, you might have phenology changes occurring in the same place where you had some kind of disaster, the seral stages. So just kind of keeping in your mind when you're out there and looking at things, that your questions kind of teasing out the differences of what's going on in those stages of plant and animal communities, and it can change. So kind of keeping an eye open for if there are signs of there had been a fire or a flood or something, and that might change some of your phenology activity going on. So kind of keeping your questions tied. And then I'm calling this form and function because a lot of the phenology or the seral stages, that's kind of larger, long-term, and also trend type of information and things that you're seeing. But you're also going to be looking and seeing things in nature where it could be that direct influence of weather on how that plant is functioning. So you see a little picture there of these leaves are actually dried out from a heat event. So when you had an extreme temperature, that is going to influence the form and function of some of these plants. And so some of your questions when you're separating phenology from these other things, thinking about those immediate weather events and what's going on there. So even in this photo here, you're going to have both phenology notes looking at, oh, it looks like it probably already had berries. You can see where those dried parts are. So it's at a certain phase for phenology, but also is having these other things that having dried leaves was not a phenology phase that this plant is going on. So being able to kind of differentiate in your notes. All right, so one thing I think is really important for talking about phenology is your metadata. I'm sure if you're on the Facebook Nature Journal Club page, you'll see people like Roseanne Hansen, who I think every single journal page she does, she has metadata. She puts the weather information and things always on there. And that's super helpful to continually add that weather data. But to separate and recognize that phenology is sort of this range of weather conditions, that it's springtime. And for you in your area to think about, what is that range? What is that spring of, do you have freezing temperatures? Do you have, this temperature range? That's kind of your phenology foundation there versus just that immediate day temperature. So can you be taking notes along the way, also thinking about what is that seasonal range of conditions that those plants and animals are kind of responding to? So you want your metadata as in just what you actually got, your temperature, but you also want to be thinking about those ranges. And so a lot of websites and places you can go to also look at things like freezing hours is pretty important for phenology, for agriculture. When almonds or other things are growing, when do they want those to time those sorts of things, thinking about certain critical weather components and the duration over time. So it's good to have a mix of metadata. So for myself, I have done some kind of personal research, creating what I kind of think of as a profile for my area. And I'm using Weather Underground as one of my weather sites I go to, but there are tons of them. I think you find what is comfortable, what finds where you can get your mix of information. Maybe you have the tools to take weather yourself. All great things to do. I kind of like pulling from a website because I'm not going to go out regularly to get all my weather conditions, but also to get an idea of those cycles and how they are connected to weather and climate. There are a number of really cool websites. This organization, it used to be Point Reyes Bird Observatory, PRBO. Their website address actually is still data.prbo.org. And quite a few other ones. Audubon, a number of sites have really cool climate-related information associated with different species. So it's kind of an interesting way to know, have that baseline profile of, oh, okay, so this species is more sensitive to these sorts of things. And you can kind of build up, and then your questions start to have some meaning and context. Not sure how well you guys can see this. This is another website, and just one other kind of piece for metadata to think about. A lot of people look at moon cycles in phenology, and they can have influences on wildlife behavior. It may not have the seasonal things, but what does have a seasonal influence on species phenology is the number of solar hours. So if you have 8 hours of daylight versus 10 hours, and tracking that, and there are tons of websites that track solar hours. This was actually a hunting fishing one where they set up when they think the best periods of time when you're going to have the most activity for your hunting and fishing success. And it pulls in some of that information, which is kind of fun to look at. So solar hours is another really interesting one. And then, maybe it's not phenology, but knowing what's going on with the moon and other things and how that's influencing those cycles. Another interesting website, USGS, US Geological Survey, has a number of websites. This, I went on and did a screen capture for my area. This is my, you guys did a sit spot. I have kind of a walk spot and a sit spot. And I regularly walk my dogs along this particular area. And going on to this website, it's kind of pixelated looking, but it mapped out, this website, what the kind of key phenology phase is for the different vegetation in that area. And I thought, oh, interesting. And it kind of got me out of my normal assumptions of everything blooms in the spring. And I looked at this and I saw, oh, so there's some stuff that's probably going through some kind of key phenology phase in January. And I'm seeing all the pixelated colors for that beige color. And I go back out and I see, oh yeah, look at, there's these shrubs that are blooming in January. And I had just sort of mentally not been paying attention. So some interesting websites that can help you deepen your questions. Other websites, this place called Database, and I don't think it's worldwide. I know it has a lot of North America, but I think there are lots of similar sites that you can find different places in the world that have migration corridors, because obviously migration is tied to a lot of phenology, seasonal things that they're looking for their food sources. So insects and things they're coming after. So it's kind of interesting, not just what you're seeing, but if you have that profile and know that there are certain migration corridors and where do you live in perspective of that, and being able to connect some of those observations and the timing of those, helpful to have that reference back. This is the Weather Underground site that I use for what you're going to see, some my journaling. You can't always find weather station exactly where you are, but when you go onto these different websites, you should be able to find one close enough to you for the purposes of phenology or climate change sort of information. And this site allows you to find weather all the way back in history. So if I'm not taking daily weather, but I do want to do a month's worth of data comparison, I can go back and pull up the weather. It does, you can look at weekly or monthly, but the weekly and monthly don't have the historic information. So if you look at the middle photo screen capture, what I really like on this one is it has not only what the daily temperature, high and low was, but it has the historic average and then the record high. So you can kind of compare what's going on in context of climate change, or even seasonally of kind of what's going on. So there's some interesting things, and you can dig around and find some really cool information online. Other thing I'd mention, it can be really helpful to be a part of citizen science group. So iNaturalist, eBird, Nature Notes, Globe Observer is a NASA related one, I See Change. You end up contributing to a bigger picture, and it's not necessarily the awesome nature journaling you're doing, but you can learn. It's a great community, and it can give you ideas if you're on there kind of looking once in a while, seeing what people are doing, of how people are observing or taking notes. So it's a good exchange, something to use. So now let's get into more of what we want to talk about, of kind of how would you nature journal and connect to phenology. So I think just sit with that for a second and think about your area and what your season is and what kind of annual seasonal life cycles things are going through around you. And I think about what you might connect there.
And does anyone have any questions at this point for this portion of the discussion?
Cool. Yeah, feel free to interrupt at any point. So we talked a little bit about metadata, but then how can you kind of expand your observation? And I would think that all of us probably have a John Muir Laws guide to nature journaling. And in there, I really like looking back at some of these methods of how do you diagram or measure things, connect things, estimate things. Super helpful, but frame that with those seasonal life cycles and the climate. You got to combine those two. So think about how you're connecting, making that matching up between those things. And sometimes knowing some of your field of measurements can be helpful in doing things. I'm going to kind of go through some of my deeper questioning and how knowing how to go out and take measurements can be helpful in your own kind of experiments. So I think these are all free if you don't have the book. So here I've kind of outlined how I like to step my questions, my nature journaling observations, take it into a deeper mode to kind of think about these more long-term trends. And I've kind of framed them as exploration, kind of how you deepen your questions of what you are observing and how you connect it. And it's not always obvious. With that, I think you need to explore and practice. So that's part of just capturing these notes and thoughts and making connections and exploring what seems to be making sense to you or what starts to tell your story. So kind of just explore your questions, but try to connect them to climate and weather and those cycles things are going through. My other question is experimentation, kind of setting up how the place, the time, and how you can make your observations connect better to weather. So, for instance, not only having a sit spot, but where within your sit spot, what are you looking at? What time of day? What seasons do you want to design your observations around? Because you're trying to connect to things. So maybe it's, you're thinking about, I want to see things in shade and in the sun to kind of get an idea of how temperatures are maybe affecting things, or just these particular plants because they have more visible changes for seasonal cycles that I can look at. And these are the dates that early spring is probably the better time for me to do phenology, or maybe the fall and the beautiful leaf changes. It's not something you have to do every day, all day. You might just frame, when you want to start doing these observations. So you're kind of setting up an experiment of, I want to go these times. This is where I'm thinking I will be seeing certain changes. And then evaluating things that a lot of people are doing really awesome observations about these life cycles and things going on, and people are putting some metadata, but they're not necessarily thinking about what it's telling them, these trends. So is there a way through your nature journal that you're indexing some information, or maybe there's a monthly or seasonal summary sheet where you plan to save those pages and take notes from your previous observations and kind of evaluate, see what questions you have from your own data and your own journaling. So thinking about how do you explore your questioning, how do you set up the timing to make these observations, and then evaluating it. So here's some of my kind of sloppy journaling, but for me, exploring. So last year, I decided that I wanted to journal about fire weather. And part of it is in my job in the government, we say, pay attention, that fire weather is important. But what does that mean? What does it look like? So I wanted to just personally take it on and go, okay, if I'm just somebody out there that the government or people are telling me to pay attention to fire weather, what would that mean? How would I become more observant of it? So I started exploring all these different weather information, and I have this little small year kind of journal organizer, which I had gone through. And so I'd experiment on what worked. And I have a lot of things on there that I dropped really quickly because it's a lot of information and it wasn't meaningful. And then I explored the visuals. So how can I take some of that information, combine observations with the data? And I experimented with kind of thinking of the phenology wheel, but I was going to do a weather wheel with kind of categorizing it around what I'm exploring. So for me, wind, temperature, moisture, the relative humidity, was important for what I wanted to explore. That was kind of my experiment that I set up. So I go about doing that. And then kind of to connect it back to nature, I was trying to think about in my experiment, my walk spot. I walk along a particular little path, and that you see the dry grass there and the little map of kind of where I am. I wanted to start just doing quick sketches of what the landscape would look over time, like a little snapshot. Is the grass green and short? Is it tall and dry? What over time? I thought that's probably how my experiment, I might start to see changes. And so doing that and then capturing some key observations for the month and putting them on that page along with my weather trends. And then I'm starting to add things on there that there are a number of websites that tell you small fires or heat signatures versus wildfires. So I'm trying to find ways to connect that. I'm exploring and experimenting month to month, and I'm not doing it every single month, but I'm trying to see what's meaningful. And so I started to step away from my observations and then started to use news information and other websites associating the fire weather with fires occurring there, connecting it. And then on this one, I have stepped so far out of actual observations. I was really getting caught up in having fun with data and trying to figure out how do I visualize data. And it's kind of fun and interesting, but this particular month doing this, I realized, whoa, I am super far off track. So this is kind of my evaluating, going, I am not doing what I want to do here. I am slipping past things. And it's been a fun experiment, but I'm going to move on and try something else. So having your sit spot in the ongoing path or something you can view over time, super, super important for monitoring these things changing in cycles or over time. And one thing, when I evaluated my fire weather and things that I'm looking at, I realized, I want to be able to walk outside. My intent is to think about, I want to sense, is there a high risk of fire right now? And you apply this concept to wanting to sense when flowers might start blooming. What is that sense? What does it feel like for you? What does it look like when it's spring or it's fall and things should be happening? And for me, wind is probably the most important attribute for fire. And so I have a tree that's that I can see regularly that I knew was kind of out in the open and would have influence from each direction on the wind. And so that was my picking part of my sit spot, walk spot of, I want to observe wind. I want to be able to look at a tree and go, oh, it's probably 6 miles an hour wind coming from the north, from the south, and sketch that over time. And it was kind of meditative. I wasn't always just journaling what I saw. I was also looking at the weather trends and then just trying to sketch what I would imagine it would look like. But it was an interesting experiment to try and go through and get a little more connected. So I think that personalizing that and deciding how frequent you need to do it. I wouldn't in the future try to do this every day. I would set up my experiment to pick when I know certain wind events are coming in. I would design when I would go out and monitor and try and visualize and capture those notes that seem really relevant for the wind that I wanted to look at. So earlier I mentioned separating phenology, like that annual seasonal life cycle something is going through, from the form and function or that sural stage of something that had a disaster, some kind of impact and was recovering. So for me, I'm looking at wind, and for me, remembering and differentiating things. And so that form and function isn't just that immediate, it can be long term. So seeing a windswept tree, that's being influenced by weather, but that's not phenology. That's not its normal budding and life cycle it's going through, but it still is weather. And so it's interesting to take notes, and you can always kind of keep questioning, is there a way for me to connect phenology to this? Could it be that really strong winds in that area is going to change the phenology than just over the, a few hundred yards out of the wind? Probably. So thinking about these questions, framing them, and the other picture is just an example of a storm event versus this long-term influence. And it can tell you really deep stories that typically a prevailing wind, which is a wind that's your regular ongoing wind, is going to have kind of this long-term influence of the shape of things around you, where storm winds are very often coming from a different direction or an area where that plant hasn't necessarily adapted to it, or there's significantly higher wind events that are going to cause things to break and fall and that sort of thing. So interesting stories to tell with weather that you can see on the landscape. So here is what I have most recently been working on. This was for February, and I had moved away. I had kind of experimented with the weather wheels and did not think it was telling me what I wanted it to tell me. And this year, my experiment is more looking at climate and phenology. So my Weather Underground site, I'm able to go there, and for each day, so each line on this graph, each column is a day. And so the first, you can see there that there's a yellow at the top that's 74 degrees Fahrenheit was the historic high record temperature. The very bottom row of purple, you see at 28 degrees. And for that, the 1st of February, historically in climate, the lowest temperature was 28 degrees. My middle line there is representing that average temperature for that day over time, that historic average. And then I am comparing the daily weather. So the temperature high was 68 degrees, the temperature low was 39. And so I'm basically measuring how many degrees different am I from the historic? How is the climate changing? What is my daily weather in context of over time? And so I measured the degrees difference for both that high and low, and then I'm coloring it in kind of to connect my color code for what it sort of feels like, that temperature range. And then now that I have that going, it's kind of interesting. So I'm doing my daily observations, and you can see that around the 7th, 8th, 9th, I started observing in my little sit spot the first time I saw a bee. And it doesn't mean that a bee they're not out there, but I wasn't seeing them very often. I just saw one bee and one butterfly, and I'm like, okay, what kind of phenology questions? How can I connect weather? And so I went on an internet search and looking around, looking at research papers, and did find that for bees and butterflies, temperature is critical to not only just their phenology, their life cycles of when they emerge or when they migrate, but just their daily function too. If it's too cold, they can't even move. And when it gets warm, they have more movement, can fly further and do more. At certain temperatures, they might die. And so it was really fun to dig through that little experiment and be able to connect what weather and climate trends that I'm seeing and how those observations. So you can start digging in pretty deep. And this isn't something I do every month. It can be intensive, but it can be really fun and a really interesting way to learn something in a really deep way connected to weather. So here's some examples. This is from Instagram, Laura Gastinger. She, and I think a lot of people do, these perpetual journal things, which is really interesting way. I don't know if all of them, this doesn't look like it includes the weather, so I kind of feel like it's not completely connecting with phenology, but it's telling part of the story. And so how interesting so she did from March 19th to the 25th, captured each day little things that they're seeing. So you kind of pick your range that you're going to look at, whether it's throughout a year, you keep coming back to the same one for those dates, or a month, or however long, and connecting visual observations to those changes. So I think a perpetual journal is a really interesting option to connect phenology. Here, Laura Cunningham, this is a block diagram, and I think it offers, if you have a larger area you want to look at for your phenology, or maybe you want to connect weather, and so you want some different layers to the environment to try and see connections a little bit more. So this could be interesting if you wanted to connect precipitation. Is it, do you have moist soils? Have you had some historic rain? So you'd still want to add some weather, seasonal information, and then have your notes on what kind of phases or life cycles you're going through here to connect your phenology. Here again, Laura has the same exact landscape over time, which is really visually interesting and really nice way to connect seasons. It's winter, spring, and summer. I think you would also want to have notes on what the seasonal temperatures and rain. How much rain did you have that year? Is it all the same year or different years? So those would be really interesting visuals, but connecting some of that data as well is a really great way to connect phenology. Here's Laura's edible plant calendar. This is so fun and like a really interesting, usable way to connect phenology, because the fruits, obviously that's a key phase, the nut or the fruit. And knowing what time of year those edible plants in your area, when they're at that edible phase. And so having the species list there, and then your months spread out when those things are available. Super fun. Again, phenology, you still want to connect some of those weather trends. So maybe there's some notes somewhere on this or somewhere else where you're tracking and seeing, are they changing? Did certain months, were they warmer than normal? Mixing in, but having that connection of what the seasons are like. And here's another one of hers. This was in the East Bay, where she was tracking flowers blooming and over the month. And this is really interesting. I think it could be really fun to expand on the little sketches and maybe have the bud as the first, and then, whatever it looks like when it's kind of lost most of its flowers or most of its petals. So different ways to show this, just showing which months they were in season. But again, you probably want a little bit of weather notes somewhere connecting those, but it doesn't have to be on the same page. All right, so I'm getting close to kind of getting towards the end of this a little bit, but what's really, I think you don't want to miss that a lot of these seasons, we have really interesting memories and impressions of what these different seasons feel like and what they mean. And I think that's important to add to. And this picture you see here, this artist from Australia had done, she had a whole showing of these different pictures where she wants to show the natural environment, the vegetation, in a way that is connecting with how she or the community was feeling. In this particular leaf, she was describing it as, for them, after the wildfires, they felt brittle and worn and chewed up and spit out. And what a beautiful, interesting way to kind of connect a season or a feeling of something out there. That's an observation. She saw this eucalyptus leaf all and trying to survive through this really dry drought and these wildfires, insect infestations, and it really represented how she was feeling. So I think super valuable to connect your more subjective emotional things as well. So just tying back to our observations, thinking about, what are you seeing that's a phenology phase of the first budding? It's just now starting to bloom. And what date is that? And what was the temperature range you could connect? Versus, all right, so here's a plant that had a heat, a drying, a burning of its leaves. And maybe you saw it was a high temperature and went out and looked, or maybe it was just a coincidence and then you went back and found that it was a high temperature and put notes about that. But connecting back and forth and knowing the difference. And this is my last slide. And what I think is really interesting here, sometimes your questions, it's going to be hard to know phenology, serial stage, form, function, what's going on here? And is it at the landscape scale or close up? And these are images all kind of capturing what's going on related to weather. And so this is the Sierra Nevadas, and we've had significant bug infestations. And partly this happened because this was after a long period of drought, because insect infestations are a normal part of this ecosystem. And you would have seen a few of those in there. So knowing that there's a normal thing going on in there, but this has way too many dead at the same time. So there's this kind of like a wildfire or anything else. There's this impact that's happening significantly. And what is that story telling you related to weather? And not only was there a drought, which made these trees more vulnerable, it was a hot drought, because even though California has had significant drought periods in the past, we've never had them with temperatures as high as we've been having. And so this was a very interesting thing, and you can go in all different kinds of directions thinking about the weather and the changes. And so there could be phenology changes going on in some of these pictures and scenes, along with some kind of serial stage, but it's connecting to this climate and weather trends and things going on. And the two photos to the right, the top one, so a lot of trees, when they're under stress, they can have this clear sap. And a lot of trees actually can survive this. I kind of like to think about it like sweating out the toxins or something. A lot of trees, when there's been a fire, you'll see them sapping out like this. Sometimes they'll die, but a lot of times they will still survive. But when you look at the photo below it, that red sap, it doesn't have enough moisture to really sap out or to really kind of recover from what's happening. And a sign that tree is dead. It might take a while for all of its leaves to die, even a few years. But when you see the red sap like that, which is interesting, it's like blood. That tree is dying. It's dead, and there's a lot of weather connections, and that was caused by insects there. But interesting to look close up and big scale. So I think, yep, that was my last slide. Brian, I don't know if I went, I'm going to stop sharing. What my time is. I tend to go faster even though I had a lot of slides. So how are we with our time?
That was great. It's 10:45. That was excellent timing. We have time for questions, or if people want to talk about how they might incorporate this into their own journaling. If you want a simple place to start, we could, because of the temperatures here, we're seeing a lot of changes right off the bat. Like last week, I think a few people noted that their penstemons just started blooming. Mine just started blooming like 3-4 days ago, right? And so you can start to create a palette of place. And so you could just record the color of the penstemon without doing a formal drawing, and then start to incorporate some of the natural data that you discussed, the weather data and temperature data. I thought the freezing hours was particularly interesting, right? We've seen winter become shorter over the past few years, right? And obviously these efforts as citizen scientists can contribute to the government's own understanding of these events, right? So recording our observations locally can feed into sources like iNaturalist, right, that you discussed, and all those others. So we can see when the wildflowers are blooming. Are the penstemons blooming in a normal time for penstemons to be blooming? Is it different than it was last year? And, over time, you can start to see differences. And so that's really interesting piece here. But I don't know.
One thing I would just mention, so now that I've started trying to pay attention to what is within the normal range and what's different, I actually have woke up early in the morning a few times because I heard a hermit thrush singing, or maybe it's even a month now, and I was thinking, whoa, I don't typically hear, and I don't believe the hermit thrush would typically breed down here. And so I was curious of, are they migrating through, heading up to a higher altitude, or is for some reason, is this one deciding to try and give it a go down here? But knowing the species that are in your area naturally and they're migrating through, so whether it's plants or animals migrating, geese, in the valley here, we're so lucky we have, I think not long ago we had the sandhill cranes migrating through, and then recently we've had the white-fronted geese. And so again, they're migrating through. They have a phenology phase, food sources and things, and so really interesting ways. But you kind of got to think about adding that context of some of the weather, the climate, of what trends and ranges might be driving them and attracting them to those areas.
All right. Any questions from anyone?
So I don't know if people have questions or want to, and I do have like a couple of ideas of if people want to use this as an exercise or if they want to do their own thing. Do you want me to kind of mention what could be an exercise for them to do?
Absolutely.
Okay, so I was thinking that, so first going out there, make sure you take some metadata. So just getting used to putting down some of the weather, the temperature, winds, sunny, cloudy, a mix of things, but make sure you have your metadata, have a source there. Maybe think about how and where you put it. So if you were going to be going back over time, like do a monthly summary, you could go back and compare that you have the same kind of data. So maybe the time of day and some of those things. But so first make sure you have your metadata. And then 2, look for some observations, sketch and take notes on something that is going through it, like a seasonal life cycle in your area of, is it the temperatures have got warm enough and things are just sprouting and blooming, or, things kind of at the tail end of that and they're now moving from blossoms to early fruit or something. So try and visually capture some notes on what kind of life cycle things are going through. Could be butterflies too. And then ask some deeper questions, thinking about those observations of how you might frame an experiment, like what months you might be coming back or how you might come back to see those changes in that. Deepen your questions around those climate trends, and also think about, write some notes on your area and this, what represents your season, for you. Spring, it might be, your springtime, or is this range like kind of this generally, doesn't get much hotter than this, doesn't get that cold. What are your kind of, so subjectively think about what does this season represent to you? Because just the specific temperature is just a moment in time, but that phenology is based on this larger. So kind of define what your season is, and maybe there's a neat way to represent it visually. But I think thinking about those 3 things, your key metadata of that moment you're out there, because that could influence what you're seeing, the life cycle, observation, sketch, and then deepen it to some kind of seasonal connections. That's my thought.
Great. Does that sound good to everyone? So why don't we take some of these ideas? You can see what works for you. You recommend Weather Underground for checking data historically. And then so you can start to get that metadata in, and then incorporate what sort of your descriptive statistics are, right, for your area. So what's sort of the average spring, what species you might expect to see, what do you observe, and all that. So I think that's a great place to start. So why don't we spend a little bit of time doing this, and then we'll meet back at 12. Does that sound good to everyone? All right.
Great.
That sounds good.